How about we get started and we'll do introductions that are so inviting and delightful that people will just be okay if they join in while we're talking. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining us for our fourth webinar in our Azrieli Family Education Series, held out of CAMH, but right now held in my basement and Lee's home and everybody else's home or wherever they are today. I'm the director of the Azrieli Center, and I'm really excited for this session. And I think I'm going to probably wear like a bit of my hat as someone who does some clinical and research work in the developmental disabilities community, but I'm also going to wear my sister hat because I am a family caregiver, and this is about us as caregivers. So I think I'm going to try to give both to the talk today. And Lee, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yes, thanks, Yona. I'm Lee Steele, and I'm the parent of a young man who's just about 29 years old, and his sister's birthday was yesterday. She just turned 26, so that was exciting. I'm get to be the family advisor with Dr. Lunsky's team at CAMH. It's just such a privilege, and I can see by this picture that that's probably the last time I had a haircut. So.
Okay. So just a few comments. I think we called today Caring for the Caregiver, and we even hinted that we're going to be talking about self-care. And I just want to say, because there's been a lot of people have different reactions when they hear the word self-care, because I think sometimes people think self-care means you really just need to take it easy, give yourself a little bubble bath, you know, have a drink and sit down. That's taking care of yourself. We're not talking about bubble baths today. We have no bubble bath images whatsoever. When I use the word self-care, I'm not saying that you need to do that work by yourself. I'm just saying that the person we're focusing on caring for is you or me or Lee. It's not the person that we love who has a developmental disability. Okay, so how we give that care is very much, I think, a community's responsibility. It's us with other people. So it's not something we have to do in sort of lonely solo fashion. It's just that the person we're focusing on is us. And if I was to kind of summarize the two things that I think we all need to be remembering and reminding ourselves over and over and over again that we can do, especially now during a pandemic, our number one, it's our job to know where we're at any given moment. And we'll talk more about that over the course of the hour in terms of what that means. But if we don't know where we are and kind of what we need, it's really hard for us to take care of ourselves and for us to work with other people so they can help to take care of us. And the other thing is that we need to be sort of constantly, repeatedly, you know, recognizing that we need to give ourselves permission once we know where we're at and what we need to do whatever needs to happen in that moment to address those needs, right? So, and it may be, you know, permission to focus completely and utterly on the person that we love, because that's the most important thing in that moment. It may be permission to mess up or do something that later we look at ourselves and say, oh gosh, that was so stupid. Or it may be permission to just walk away and do nothing, or permission to say, you know what, I really need to ask for help, or I really need to just not be in the room right now with my sister, with my daughter, with my son, because I really need to just take a breath, you know? So it's really recognizing that we have to give ourselves permission. It's nobody else's job to give us that permission. And that also it isn't someone else's job to know what it is that we need if we don't know what we need ourselves. Next slide. Okay, so this is just one tool, and there's a link at the bottom. And I should say we're recording this webinar, and all of the links and sort of resources and things that we comment on will be made available to everybody after the webinar with the link to the webinar. This is a scale that I developed with Jonathan Weiss about 10 years ago now. And it's really simple in some ways. It's a 10-point scale. We almost envisioned it to be like a thermometer, where you just kind of say like, how intense are things right now at this moment for our family? So when I say know where you're at, it's kind of knowing, are you a 10? Are you a 6? Are you a 2? Recognizing that this can change even within a day, it can fluctuate, right? So we're not at the same number all the time, but we need to be concerned when we see that we're at the same high number for a concerted, we may have a moment where we feel like, oh my gosh, it is absolutely horrible. and then we take a breath or we take a walk or things come down, an hour later and we go, it's bad, but it's not as bad as I thought in that very dark moment. But it may be that it's that bad and it stays like that over the course of a few days. And at that point, we really need to be getting help. And I would say we even need to be getting help, when things are lower than an 8, a 9, or a 10. But this is kind of a way to explain to other people where you're at and how your family is managing. And I think it's a really useful tool. Clinicians use this tool, but as families, we can also use this tool and share it with clinicians to talk about where it is or where we are and how we're doing. Next slide. Another very general concept I wanted to go over is the HELP model. And if you joined us for our webinar, I guess it would have been 2 months ago, where we talked about kind of a framework for understanding mental health issues for people with developmental disabilities. We referred to this model, which we also use a lot when we train healthcare providers to recognize issues for people with developmental disabilities. And I had this kind of aha moment the other night when I was thinking about things I wanted to talk about. And I thought, you know what? We talk about this as though it's for people with developmental disabilities, but it's actually just as valid right now, I think, for ourselves. So I'm just going to go through the H, the E, the L, and the P as a reminder for when we're thinking about how we need to give ourselves permission to take care of ourselves or have people help take care of us and what we need, to think about these 4 aspects of what it is that we need to do to promote our mental health. So if we go to the next slide, the first letter H in the HELP model for people with developmental disabilities is a reminder that before we sort of address what we call maybe a psychiatric or mental health issue, we have to step back and say what is going on in terms of their physical health. But this is talking about us now as families. And it's just a reminder that, amidst all the sort of what we think might be depression or, anxiety, we have to stop and say, wait a minute, are we eating? Are we having, 6 to 8 glasses of water in a day? Are we getting non-disrupted sleep? Are we able to get any kind of exercise? Is our bedroom like absolute shambles with no structure and a big kind of mess and we can't find anything and we're not moving and we're just sitting, right? So physically, are we addressing, if we have a health issue ourselves and it's hard right now to access healthcare, are we having a virtual visit with our doctor and addressing those things? Or are we just kind of under the covers with all the stuff going on that we cannot address and we're not taking care of our health? So that's the H. Next is the environment. So again, for people with developmental disabilities, we talk about this idea that you need to think about, do you have the supports in place for that person that you love right now? Are the expectations too high, or are there not enough supports for them? And so it's making the environment quite stressful. Well, that applies to us as well, right? So what's happening for families right now is families may be not supported enough in their environment to do their jobs as caregivers, right? Unfortunately, during the pandemic, it's not often the opposite, whereas that families are getting too much support. I think what we're hearing from families is they're not getting enough support, nor are their loved ones. And the environments are disrupted and the environments are stressful. And for some people, they're quite contained and there isn't really a lot of places that people can go, and that's incredibly difficult. So, and the point, I guess, with all 3 of these so far, so we're now going to talk about lived experience, is that we don't start to address what's going on in terms of mental health issues or psychiatric issues until first we've addressed these other things. So number 1 is take care of your health. Number 2 is be aware at least of what's going on and what's changed in the environment, even if we can't put those supports in place. But sometimes that's all we need. Recognizing that that's an issue is really important before we start treating mental health problems. So the third sort of step in help is recognizing the lived experience, particularly things like trauma, things that are really difficult, losses, things that are going on. And of course, for the person with a developmental disability, that's hugely important, but it's also important to us because as caregivers, there's a lot of grief and a lot of loss that's happening for us right now. There's a lot of things we don't have control over that are very upsetting. There's also a lot of almost re-traumatizing that's happening where something happens that we see with our loved ones, something happens with us, and it reminds us of another situation where something like this happened before and how awful that was. So understanding that what is so difficult right now is not just about something inside us, but it's about things that are happening to us, and recognizing, the weight of that and the impact of that, I think can shift a little bit how we respond or how we support ourselves or how others can support us. And then the P, the last letter here, is thinking about sort of the psychiatric components. So, all of us are in situations where we're probably neglecting aspects of our physical health, where our environments are stressful and disrupted without enough support, where there's definitely sort of life events and lived experiences that are hard. But even if we kind of acknowledge or address all those things, we still may be having difficulties emotionally that sort of go beyond that and that may need sort of psychiatric attention or mental health support. So that's kind of the last part of the help model.
So I like this quote written by Sue Robbins, who's also a parent, that having a child with a disability makes you instantly and constantly vulnerable. In a world where we are supposed to be strong, feeling vulnerable is very uncomfortable. And that is so true. And I was just thinking about Brene Brown's work about vulnerability, and she also says that vulnerability is not weakness and is in fact the birthplace of joy, belonging, creativity, authenticity, and love. So I think to balance that vulnerability with the strength of vulnerability as well. So the next slide, please. So often it's difficult, especially during this time, to just take some time for ourselves. So although this is so important, it can be done simply, and the fact that our breath is always with us, it's like a mobile anchor. We can call on it at any time. So why don't we just take a moment now just to practice just doing 3 breaths. So I'm just going to ask you to bring your attention to this moment. And often we're in the past or the future. So let's just bring the attention to this moment that we're in right now, where we have some choice. So you can even take a second to warm up your hands if you like, and place one even on your heart like a friend. And just notice your feet on the floor. If your hand isn't on your heart, maybe just resting them on your thighs, or feeling your seat on. Or you can just find a fixed spot on the floor or somewhere, just so that your gaze is constant, not looking around. And I just invite you now to take a deep breath in through your nose and then exhale through your mouth like a big sigh. And your next breath in, just like you to imagine a sense of calm. You can even ask yourself, is there something that I need? And as you exhale, imagine you're exhaling any tension, just an invitation to let go. And this final breath, just breathe in a sense of ease, strength, appreciation, whatever works for you, and exhaling anxiety or fear, stress. We can take these 3 breaths anytime, anywhere. So the next slide, please. Just wanted to talk about a few things that we have heard from other families about some of the experiences they've had during this time of COVID. And this first picture is like a deer in the headlights. And the quote is from Helen Reese, a sister who found that her situation had changed quite a bit when all of the supports that she was used to having for her brother were gone. And we found this too. Like, we find this as caregivers, that at first COVID was very new. It was rapidly changing, lots of instructions that we weren't familiar with, the shutting down of programs, changes in our routine. If we were working from home, not being able to work. There was so much to absorb at first. If your loved one was in a group home, maybe perhaps suddenly you couldn't visit. And just adjusting to all of these changes all at once. And now we find ourselves adjusting to the sort of long term, this new normal. And what does that mean? And so it's also a time to kind of question, I found. So because this is going to go on for some time, I can ask myself, what kind of life do I want for my loved one and for myself? And what are some of the steps that I need to take? And who can I connect with so that I'm not doing this alone? The next slide talks about us being the fixer. You know, I think we're really good at this, especially after years of practice. But finding the supports that we had put in place and that they're suddenly maybe gone or definitely reduced brings this care back to us again. And for those whose loved one was in a group or is in a group home, how do you advocate and support when you feel separate? So that problem solver role that we've had for years now kind of feels like we're a little bit more powerless to do what we've maybe always done really well. And how to make things better, that's a new emotion for us, to feeling powerless, but it's also a great opportunity to reflect on that trying to always fix things is not sustainable. And perhaps we need to increase the circle of support for our loved one and for ourselves. Can we invite family or friends or siblings who maybe we haven't included in the same way into open conversations so that we're not feeling that we are the one responsible to fix a situation that in many ways is not fixable at this time. The next slide, please. This one really represents how I've been feeling off and on. You know, just to acknowledge that coping with our emotions, there's frustration, there's anger, and underneath that is also fear and grief, I've noticed. We're trying to reassure ourselves at the same time I'm trying to reassure my loved one. And I like this metaphor that, like a beach ball, if you try to hold a beach ball under the water, it kind of comes springing out where you least expect it. And that's kind of like how I feel about when I'm trying to suppress my emotions. You know, I end up, saying I have to not really face how I'm feeling right now, how sad I actually feel, or how fearful I actually feel. And so then it comes out in frustration or anger. Or maybe I think, oh, I've got to wear a mask, and that has an impact on my mental health, because again, that's not sustainable. I need somebody trusting that I can talk to at this time. I need to be able to reach out and just say I need a chance, I need to vent, or I need to cry, or I need to have a chance to just express how fearful or frustrated I feel. And the fact that we aren't having any breaks right now, often, we need to sort of have our own toolkit of who can we call? Who can we call on for support, or what can we do? Maybe just taking those 3 breaths could even help. The next slide, please. This slide speaks to me about a feeling that I've been having that I've actually never been so aware of my age and my own vulnerability as I have been through this time. And just asking myself the question of what happens if my loved one gets sick, or if I get sick? If they get sick, how do I visit? And what happens if I get sick? And that's usually an emotion I'm pretty good at pushing away, unfortunately. But this time of COVID is really asking me to look at those difficult emotions and face them and put a contingency plan into place. And we hold so much information ourselves, so that contingency plan is so important. So, Dr. Lunsky and her team have really come up with these wonderful tools, and you can access them on our H card link. But there's like hospital transfer tool that's been developed with Surrey Place, talking about substitute decision making. These tools about capturing information about my loved one and using their voices, not just our voices and our knowledge, but it's a time to reflect on what works when we go to a medical appointment, what doesn't work, and capturing that in writing. Let's use this time to actually, instead of pushing it away, think about wills and finances and those kinds of things, and ensuring that this information is not only written down, but it's accessible for others if something should happen to us. Next slide, please. So this one also speaks to the little space I have perhaps to nurture myself. If we're working from home, like the work life and the home life is really merged. And if we were already at home, no breaks, or maybe no time for this self-reflection. And I'm having to move through like grief and loss in ways I've never experienced before, and maybe you've never experienced before too. So this is a time for real self-compassion. And as Dr. Lunsky said, we hear a lot about self-care, but a manicure doesn't address my mental health. So this is just a time where we really have to, take extra care in looking after ourselves and not feel guilty about that. So the next slide, please. So I like this picture of just that our batteries are definitely on low. And, we've gone on now for many months and there doesn't seem to be any end in sight. And maybe the things we normally had to look forward to with summer coming, thinking about how's that going to work. So, and the uncertainty brings up more fear and anxiety. And there's that sort of shortage of mental energy. If we were already struggling with burnout or depression prior to COVID, finding that extra energy is even more difficult. So it speaks even more to the idea of feeling depleted and looking after ourselves. Next slide, please. So we've talked a little bit about what depletes, some of the feedback that I've listened to and my own heart, what I'm finding depleting. But it's what depletes us is unique to each one of us. And I'd like just to ask now, what depletes you? And Irfan's going to help us capture some of those answers. Can you speak to that, Irfan?
Sure. So you can see on the screen right now, we have an interactive word cloud where we are inviting all of you to answer the question. To join this, I'm going to ask you to pull out your smartphones and scan the barcode that you see in the top left corner. So just open the camera app and scan that, and that will take you straight to our Slido, where you can answer the question, what are the things that deplete you? If you don't want to use your camera, you can just go on slido.com and enter the code Selfcare to join. For those people who don't have a smartphone handy, you can use the chat box to put in your answers. We have 2 people who will be helping to put these live into the word cloud. Yeah, we can see some answers coming through.
It's such a great technology, Irfan. Thanks for thinking about that. It's so nice to have this interaction and just seeing what different people are feeling.
Mm-hmm. So definitely some major themes coming out that we can see. The news is definitely being a big thing that people are finding this is depleting. A lot of uncertainty, anxiety, and overthinking. Those seem to be 3 things that are also quite common right now. I'll take a couple of more seconds just to let a few more people put in their answers.
So when we look at this, we can really see, that other people are feeling similar to us, and, and how many things that deplete us are common to us all.
Okay.
Thank you so much for trying that technology with us. It's really great. So just go on to the next slide.
And it's still open, I think. So if you had a word and you wanted to add it in, you can still add it in, and you can also still put something in the chat box to the hosts and they'll add it in.
Right. So that was the next slide, please. This was an exercise done by self-advocates, expressing what depleted them, but we can understand, when we understand how we feel depleted, then we can take steps to nourish ourselves without guilt. So for example, if I continue to say yes to others when I really want to say no, or I feel like I'm putting others' needs before my own without taking care of myself, or if I push myself to continue to think I need to produce things when what I really need is some rest, those are things that I can say, well, I'm noticing this is really nourishing or depleting me. So how can I bring some nourishment? So the next slide, we're going to ask the same question and ask you, what nourishes you? Like a plant, you need that sufficient sunlight and water and nutrients. We need to take care of ourselves too in ways that speak to us uniquely. So what are activities you enjoy? Like Dr. Lunsky said, exercise, and the help model, eating healthy, connecting with others, taking a break from the news. Even sometimes I think back on times when I had a lot of joy, like special moments that I felt joy. What was it about those that speak to me? What was it about those moments that I could maybe reintegrate in a new way? And we find ways to include those values. It's exciting to see that there's many unique ways of nourishing ourselves that you're finding as there are depleting. This is so wonderful. Some of them I'm just looking, smiling and laughter and things we can incorporate. Like right now I'm smiling as I'm nervous doing these webinars, and then I thought, just smile, that's a good one. I like to do that right now.
It's true. There's a few ideas here we can kind of grab from other people. I think also something that nourishes me might deplete you, right? So someone else might be like, I can't watch any more TV. It's totally stressing me out. But for me, my favorite activity is if we can agree on a TV program and we all sit down together and I just get completely lost in a good TV show. So I think what nourishes or depletes each of us is quite unique to us. And also, something that nourishes me today may be different than something I would pick for tomorrow, right?
So true.
We'll just take a couple of more seconds to give people a last chance to sort of put in their responses before we close this poll as well.
It's interesting that my dog is really big and there's a dog outside my window with my windows closed barking. I hope that's not too distracting.
Okay, so I'm just gonna stop the poll there. Perfect.
That was so wonderful. We may not, be used to this idea of self-care. We may be, conditioned to put others first. And, just wanted to point out that self-care is not selfish. We really notice all these unique ways you've found of nourishing yourself. And it's essential, because this is not a sprint anymore. We're on a bit of a marathon now. And to give ourselves love and caring is so important. And Dr. Lunsky, when we were preparing, she said, we can even create an A and a B list, maybe there's an A list for what we do in the short term and a B list for what we can, something we can look forward to that nourishes us. So, like we practiced a few minutes ago, maybe 3 breaths is a short term on your short term list. Build yourself perhaps a little toolkit of things I can do in the short term that nourish me, and something, go get a glass of water, eat something healthy, and then maybe something that takes some more planning. So next slide, please. Dr. Lunsky.
All right. So we wanted to take a little bit of time. The Azrieli Adult Neurodevelopmental Center, of course, does a lot of research. And we thought it's really important to say that we actually have studied and we do know stuff about what can be helpful for families. And like I said, it's not just the bubble baths. In fact, we know that bubble bath as a suggestion is not necessarily helpful at all. But there are things that do make a difference for some families. We just wanted to describe 2 things we've been studying at our center. And they're both kind of connected to sort of acceptance-based or mindfulness-based kinds of practices. And really the just 3 breaths comes from one of the studies I'm going to talk about now. So if we go to the next slide. Here's Lee, just a couple of years ago, but you don't look a day older from when that picture was taken, Lee. And she was being interviewed by Matt Galloway, actually, when he was still on Metro Morning, talking about a research study that Lee was involved in as a parent, where we can go to the next slide, where we were sort of comparing how parents did in a mindfulness-based group compared to being in a kind of support and information group. So in this study, parents could get randomly assigned to either one of these interventions. And of course, many parents wanted the intervention that was, getting information, like we're all needing, especially right now, like we want information, we need it, we need help, we need to do all these things. And parents liked both of the groups they might have been in, right, depending on which one they were in. But what we learned, this is just an example here on the slide of the kinds of activities we practice in the 6-week mindfulness program. And I mentioned the just 3 breaths is one of the activities. Here's the article where we wrote up some of our findings. What was really interesting is parents liked both of the groups, but where we saw change was actually for the parents who did mindfulness. So getting support and information maybe in that moment fuels that kind of fixer mentality we were talking about, right? But it doesn't sort of help you when things remain difficult on their own, right? So having information, knowing there's people who are supporting you, that's helpful. But as Lee says, it's not necessarily healing. And when we're really struggling, we could use a little bit of healing, and we could use some strategies or practices that help us manage the distress we're experiencing. I think mindfulness has a place for that. And also being together with other families, who share something in common with you and who are learning these skills together with you can be quite helpful as well. So in the next slide, we just show what we're offering right now in this regard, recognizing it as a pandemic, but we started studying this before the pandemic happened. As we said, is there a way for us as caregivers to learn mindfulness, but to learn it with a number of other families from our own homes, right? So not having to go to a setting downtown or wherever to participate in a class, but being able to practice something in the comfort of your own space with a blanket over your shoulders and a cup of tea or whatever you need. So we're continuing to study that. We're learning that parents actually and siblings, that being in a virtual mindfulness group has some of the same impacts or effects as what you'd get if you were in an in-person kind of group. But for some people, especially right now, it might be easier to do something obviously that's virtual instead of in person. So that's something we're continuing to study and really interested in. And also we are holding different types of groups for families, including a drop-in mindfulness group. If anyone liked the 3 breaths, you're welcome to join us on Mondays for Mindful Mondays, which is really for caregivers. And if you want to include your loved one with a disability in the practices, they're welcome to join as well. So next slide. This is a different intervention. And actually, I was involved kind of at the start of this intervention, but Lee is really one of the champions here in terms of training other parents and other clinicians to deliver this. It's something we call acceptance and commitment therapy or acceptance and commitment training. And we've been looking at the impact of this kind of workshop on families. Initially, we focused on mothers in the autism community, but we've kind of expanded since then to include mothers, fathers, siblings, and also not just people who are on the autism spectrum, but families of people with other kinds of disabilities as well. And I guess if we go to the next slide, that the main sort of aspect of, oh no, we'll go back because I forgot. Go back, yeah. Let me talk about this for one more second. The main thing in this workshop, which is quite interesting, is that we really, it's co-delivered by families and clinicians at the same time. So we're kind of recognizing the more we connect with families, the part of what's so valuable for families is actually meeting with other families and being guided by families. So if I'm just a clinician and I'm not a parent or a sibling, I'm going to learn something by having that parent or sibling in the room with me, leading with me. So we're both kind of benefiting from that. And I think families really appreciate being able to learn directly from other family members. And this is also a much sort of more, it's a bit more intense, but it's a very short intervention. So it's not 6 weeks, it's basically one evening followed by the next day. And we're learning really interesting things about that and how to spread that. Again, we've been working on training people across Canada to deliver this. Now, the challenge right now, of course, is that we can't gather as a group in a break room all day. So we're trying to think about how we might, I guess, adapt this kind of approach, helping families think about what's important, what they value, how to live lives kind of more consistent with where they want to go and what's meaningful for them. But that we do it in a way that is maybe virtual in chunks or pieces, as opposed to having people gather together in the same physical space. So, and Lee, am I talking about this slide? Is this me too? Yeah. So this is just in terms of the kinds of research we've been doing on families and supporting families in their mental health. A few things we've kind of learned, or we wanted to summarize. One is that, you know, it's not enough to just get information on its own. We actually need to know how to cope when it is frankly just difficult. And sometimes a little bit of strategy to help coping is great, but knowing also that we're completely exhausted and we can't cope and we need other people to come in and help us do the actual caregiving and other responsibilities we have is crucial. Because I think, you know, we had a slide before, Lee, talking about the oxygen mask. I heard someone say, if I see one more person talk about the oxygen mask, I'm going to scream. You know, and I think it really says something about how tired people are maybe of that metaphor, but it is important if you don't realize that you're at that point where you can't manage and you're just this close to passing out, right? You're of no use to anyone. So when you really are getting to that exhaustion point, you've got to be able to, again, maybe using the brief family distress scale, find a way to recognize where you're at and what you need. And then our task becomes problem solving to figure out how you can get something that you need in that moment because you are exhausted. We can't just give interventions to everybody without recognizing, you know, like if I wanted to offer mindfulness to you and you're a family caregiver and your loved one's right beside you, I can't tell you that you need to participate in this group alone. I need to figure out how to make a group that you can participate in with your loved one, right? Or how it can be recorded and you can watch it later in the evening and it's not a bad thing that you missed it because you couldn't do it during the day. I need to recognize that not everybody has good Wi-Fi. Right? So something that's virtual is going to be great for one person, not good for someone else. So we have to think about individual family needs and we have to change our approach to benefit each family. I think we need to keep families, like there's, you know, 100 of you involved in this webinar, which is great. Maybe the number's even gone up a bit higher. You can learn from each other and there's all kind of expertise in the room. And we need to make sure that families are the experts working with one another and advising us as clinicians on what we need to do. And finally, there really is some power or some learning that happens, not just because families are experts, but just because we connect with people who share our experience. So caregiving can be very lonely sometimes. And I would say certainly during COVID, it's even more heightened just how lonely it can be if you feel like you're doing all this work on your own and nobody's allowed into your house. So any way we can find to help people feel connected to one another, even the exercise that we did, all of us breathing together or writing down what's nourishing and depleting us, those are things that I think can be helpful. And we need to make sure as a society, as a community, that we're offering those kinds of opportunities.
So
You can tell she's more organized than me. She actually wrote down which slide she was doing, and I was relying on my memory. So am I speaking to this or are you?
Yeah, you're just finishing this up, Yona.
Okay, thanks everyone. So just the reminder here, we talked about knowing where you're at. You need to know that. And then the second step is you need, to the very best of your ability, to be able to tell people what that is, right? And I highlight here, people are not mind readers, and they do stuff all the time that pisses you off, right? Because they're getting it wrong. They're meaning well, but they don't know what you need, and they try to give you what they think you need if they were you, but they're not you, and it doesn't help. And sometimes we get really frustrated when people give us the wrong kind of help. So one solution to that is to figure out what the right kind of help is and let them know. Don't expect anyone to be a mind reader, even your spouse or your sibling or your workmate. We got to be able to tell people what helps. And sometimes when things are really hard, we actually don't know what would help, and that's okay. But we may know, especially from experience, when someone has done it and we've noticed it's not helpful, we may know what is not helpful. So if we can't tell people and communicate somehow what would be most helpful for us, maybe we can communicate what's not helpful. And the other really important thing here is that, and this comes out again and again, I think, with family caregivers in the disability community, but more broadly as well, is that we're not seeking solutions. We're not trying to fix our pain or fix our grief or fix our distress, but we need that space, right? Where we can be heard, where what's going on with us can be recognized. And other people are not necessarily comfortable with that. And we're not comfortable with it ourselves sometimes, but I think helping each other to create that space and to allow people to be heard is so important right now. I think, thinking again about the events that have been going on in the past week and the additional distress that people are experiencing in terms of sort of racialized, really painful, awful, traumatic things that are happening. Everybody needs space for that, right? And we need to find ways to support people in this distressful time to be heard. And as helpers, or the other people who are not getting the caring but are maybe supporting other people, we can help build that space for one another.
I just think also just to hold the space for ourselves, to just have take the time to be quiet and say, what's coming up for me now? It looks like frustration, but underneath that, I'm really scared or I'm really sad, and allowing our own space to hold the space to be heard, but also to hear ourselves. So the next slide just talks about some of the incredible resources that Dr. Lunsky and her team have put together. And it's all on that link at the bottom. If you haven't visited this site, I so encourage you to do so, because there's so much valuable information. This is just one example, and the next slide as well, in terms of it's just some of the events that are coming up. We have in July, Dr. Bill Sullivan is going to be joining us, talking about those difficult conversations I was talking about earlier, in terms of just how to work through some of the healthcare decision making. And Dr. Lunsky would just mentioned, every Monday you can join Sue Hutton, who's got 35 years of mindfulness experience. She's a wonderful person and a great teacher, and you can drop in on Mondays. And you can go through Eventbrite, and even how you registered for the event today, it's the same location on that HCard site. And as Dr. Lunsky mentioned, we're thinking about how can we do ACT groups differently, perhaps virtually. So Megan is our contact for that if you're interested. That's her email. So again, I just wanted to speak really briefly about just the amazing resources on the HCard website, but CAMH also has these resources, and I looked at them closely. They're very user-friendly. You can speak to them with your loved one, and there's just a wealth of information on the HCard site. And here's some additional resources of help when you're feeling worried, or there's some other really nice how to stay connected with people when we can't see them, and just some, what do I do when I have to stay home. These kinds of resources have been created with these nice visuals that just help explain them in easy to understand language. And the next slide, I think we often include this because for me it's a very powerful slide. And because for so many years I looked at supporting my loved one as I just have to figure this out. I just have to try harder. I just have to work longer. If I only worked longer, I could solve more things. But it didn't give me any time for appreciation of all my child's gifts and strengths. And it didn't give me any chance to appreciate myself or my own needs. I was so wrapped up in doing, I wasn't living. And so could this time of COVID be a time for us to reconnect to what's really important to me and to my loved one? Is it time for some deep listening instead of just doing? And we all want to be appreciated for who we are, not for what we do. And that just has to start with me. Do I appreciate who I am? And then I can't give away what I don't have. So I will start, as I appreciate and bring self-compassion to myself, I'll have that much more to give. So the next slide, please. So again, I just really encourage you to visit HCARD, and we just want to offer an opportunity for you to ask any questions that you might have. You can use the chat function, which is just at the bottom of your screen. There's like a little talk bubble there, and you could just click on that and ask any questions. And yeah, I never knew about HCARD until I joined CAMH, and I cannot believe the number of resources and helpful links there are for you. So I encourage you, and all these links will be provided to you at the end of this session. So, Dr. Lunsky, was there something more you wanted to say?
I don't think so. We can flip maybe to the next slide while people are typing in some of their questions. We'd love to answer. This is just reminding you about the next Lunch and Learn. And that is actually a photo of Bill Sullivan with one of our advisors from the coffee shed at Surrey Place. And they're showing us how to do a health exam. But I think that's going to be a great event. And then the last slide, I think, has just a few resources and links. But again, we'll share those with you in the email that we'll send out to everyone who registered for this event. So we'd love the last bit of time to answer questions or take comments from people. So Irfan will kind of moderate that if people are typing things into the Q&A or the chat.
Sorry, Yona, I talked on top of you twice there. Just the sibling collaborative, you know, I think siblings are taking on more and more responsibility, you know, and just to recognize that they need a source of support. And I looked at the sibling collaborative website last night, actually, in preparing for today, and it's just got great information from a sibling perspective. And this dual diagnosis guide, I've been reading this, and it's such a user friendly, very accessible booklet on dual diagnosis, which means mental health issues along with having a developmental or intellectual disability. So that's available at that second one, that Portico Network link. And then, of course, the individualized funding library. That's got all kinds of information on how to utilize individualized funding, it's dedicated to learning more about that topic. And then the planning network is how to create, you know, a sustainable, fulfilling life based on the desires of our loved ones, including their voice. That's not funding dependent. So those are some really great links, additional links. I think you'll find very helpful.
And the Ontario Caregiver website is just for Ontario, but some fantastic caregiving resources, whether you're a caregiver of someone with a disability or a medical issue or whatnot, really great. And also a helpline that you can call anytime with questions. So for those of you in our province, that's certainly something you can look at. So I don't see any questions. Irfan, has anyone asked us anything?
No, the only question that I have is, how do I get the links for upcoming sessions and information? And we will be sending all these links in our follow-up email to all of you, as well as some links on how to access registration for our future sessions.
Right. So Irfan's cutting out a little bit for me. I don't know if that's happening to anyone else, but we will, like I say, if you registered for this event, then going back to Eventbrite, you'll see other events. I mentioned that we're recording this webinar today. So we have on our YouTube channel for HCARD all three of the other family education webinars that we've done. So you can watch them all. You can watch this one over and over again. You can see me interrupting Lee and not remembering when it's my turn. And then also we're going to have the resources linked as well. So any comments or questions from anyone? Sometimes don't be shy. We'll stay on until this closes at 1, and you can also reach out to us after through the H-Card email, Twitter, Facebook.
We have a couple of questions coming through now.
Great.
One question we have is, do we have a list to connect with other parents of adults with special needs?
Yeah, that's a really interesting issue. I think there's different kinds of support groups that are out there that may have permissions or ways to allow people to connect with each other. Lee, I don't know if you have some specific thoughts on that one.
Almost every organization has some virtual support groups going on. Autism Ontario does. Community Living has support groups going on. Bonnie Heath from Wood Green has a parent share. So if you go on connectability.ca, there's a list of all the available virtual. There's a dads group through Extended Family for just dads. But almost every agency has put together some form of support group right now. So go on connectability.ca, search for support groups, and a whole list of options will be available to you there. That's what connectability.ca was created for, so that's kind of one-stop shopping that you can look there and see all types, and that's what I would recommend.
Thanks, Lee.
Perfect. So another question that's come through, how do we help our sibling figure out when they can leave their homes?
Right, that's a great question. I know it's a question that I have to personally struggle with every day, because in my situation, I think my sister doesn't necessarily remember what it is that I told her, or she kind of needs to hear it again. So it's sort of something we talk about repeatedly. Some of the resources we mentioned on the hcardcovid.com page might be helpful. They have sort of illustrations or photos kind of explaining the situation. So for some people who have a hard time just with words, it might be a helpful way to guide things. And we're also going to be posting just in the next couple of days, actually, and we'll send the link out for this, a number of booklets that we've adapted from Scotland, actually, around dealing with coronavirus and what that's like for people with developmental disabilities. And sometimes looking at those pictures and talking about those things can be helpful. And another nice resource, I think, is called Books Beyond Words, and we'll provide the link for that as well. It's hard. The when things will change is going to be, as we all know, dependent on lots of things that are going to be happening in the next while. And also how much I think our siblings can do is also going to depend on where they live and some of the restrictions that they may have depending on their health, depending on the kind of program that they're in, or if they're living with family or living on their own. So it's kind of individualized, that one. But I would say if you're a sibling, the Facebook group through the Sibling Collaborative might be another helpful place to talk about that question with other siblings.
Another question that's come through. My issue is with guilt. I struggle feeling that taking time or doing things only for myself is selfish, even though I know I need to do this to be able to support my son effectively. So I guess more sort of a comment there.
I know I really believe that we have been conditioned to think of putting others first as caregivers. And I know I certainly struggled with that to the point that I burned out. That by putting constantly pushing myself, my health, using that health model, my health deteriorated. I got sick. I got very burned out. It impacted my marriage. It impacted my other child, not just my loved one. So if we don't take care of ourselves, it will show up in our lives, and we will be so depleted that we can't be there for the long term. So I think we just have to park that idea of guilt and say that's actually an emotion that's not helpful, and it's not even the truth, because unless I look after myself, I have nothing left to give. So I know that feeling, and I just would really strongly encourage us all to just say, we have to take care of ourselves. We have to look at the things that nourish us, because this is a very depleting time. There's a lot going on. There's a lot of demands. I feel more tired than I have in a long time. And instead of saying, push yourself, come on, just get at it. I'm just saying, no, I actually need to rest right now. I need to take a break. I need a cup of tea. I need to go for a walk. I need to look up at the sky and just see that this too shall pass almost, you know. I, self-care is not something, or
Self-preservation.
self-preservation, yeah, and self-compassion. And even if I do feel guilty, just to say, there you are. There's that old discouraging voice saying that, oh yeah, there you are being selfish as you're looking after yourself. Just acknowledge, there's that voice again that's so hard on me. I'm still going to take the steps I need to take that nourish me. And yeah, there just really is no other answer to that except that you deserve it and you need it.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think guilt is just one of those feelings a lot of us just have. You know, so it's almost like I'm thinking about the guest house and all the different friends who visit us and stay with us sometimes in terms of our emotions. And one of those little people on our shoulders, the guilt. And I'd love to get rid of it, but maybe it's just part of what's with me, the same as the sadness or the grief or the anxiety that I have right now. But yeah, it's something we still need to do certain actions, even if we're having certain emotions that are not comfortable for us and that we don't like.
There's one more question. There's one more question, if we have the time for it. How do we help teens AWOL from foster homes or without leave? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really big question. It's a topic in itself, how we help support our loved one in terms of sort of staying with the rules, staying with where they are when they're not where we are. And I guess my one very short answer, I'd go back again to some of the resources and things that we mentioned, but I'd also talk about the importance of this being a team effort, right? So we're all wanting the same thing. We all want people to be safe and healthy and loved and to do as best they can right now. So working together with the foster family, with the resources that are out there, if there aren't enough between us and the foster family, if that doesn't help our loved one enough, who else do we need to bring in to help support them, to keep them safe? You know, having those meetings, bringing our healthcare provider into the discussion. You know, sometimes I say this to Lise sometimes, you know, people don't want to listen to me as a parent or as a sibling, but they might listen to the doctor or someone else. So sometimes different people delivering the same message has a different effect. And bringing several heads together to discuss things, sometimes we can come up with a new solution we wouldn't have thought of otherwise.
Yes, it is 1 o'clock already, but we have one last question if you want to maybe try and take a stab at that. How and where do you start to begin the planning for wills and financial future?
I think please come to our webinar in July with Bill to hear about, this is specific to healthcare decision making. I think there's a lot of helpful resources that you can find through Partners for Planning, for example, and some of the other sites that we mentioned that have really, people have taken a lot of time planned. There's different groups that have really thought about some of these issues and have really helpful advice for families. So take a look at some of those resources. We'll make sure we share them. And please don't do that work all by yourself. This is sometimes where you need some help. These are hard things to think through, but important to think about. So I wonder if we want to say thank you to everyone. It's been a full hour and we want to respect everyone's time. You took 3 breaths and you also spent 1 hour with us, which is really 1 hour for you. So kudos to all of you for doing that. It's been lovely sort of virtually trying to share thoughts with you and connect with you. And we'd love your feedback. You will get a little email, like I said, with resources, but also with a survey link that helps us to know how we're doing, how this went, what else you want to learn about, and how we can better support you. So thank you.
Thanks, everybody.